And today we are privileged to have on the show the President and Chief Operating Officer of the Philippine Airlines, Mr. Gilbert Santa Maria. Mr. Santa Maria was a former COO of the US-based BPO company IBEX Global. He has a master's in public and private management from the Yale University School of Management and a BS in electrical engineering from the University of the Philippines in Diliman. Now, Philippine Airlines has been in the business for 80 years and a long-revered company and a symbol of Filipino pride. Just like any other airline around the world, our national carrier is no exception to the impact of the pandemic. Now, to the common traveler, the filing of Chapter 11 bankruptcy is quite jolting news. Just to be clear with our viewers, Chapter 11 bankruptcy, also known as reorganization or rehabilitation bankruptcy, is different from liquidation bankruptcy, wherein the business must sell off its assets to pay the creditors. Chapter 11 gives the company opportunity to reorganize and to re-emerge as a healthier business. Now, on that note, Mr. Santa Maria, welcome to the program. May I call you Gilbert?
Please, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, sir. I remember you telling me before that you prefer to be called Gilbert. Now, can you quickly run through us the effect of the pandemic on our national carrier, beginning with March 2020?
March 2020, a number of different things happened. All our revenue disappeared the middle of March, and fuel prices collapsed, which means we were upside down on our hedges. So we ended up having a severe liquidity crunch, as well as a situation where we became essentially untenable, losing significant amounts of revenue, $2 billion in that particular year last year, and pretty much $2 billion relative to 2019 this year. So the pandemic has been a terrible force to contend with.
That's true. But in spite of all the dreadful news we have been reading about businesses and economies, Philippine Airlines has mounted a recovery plan in response to the challenges of this pandemic. This is good news. We'd like to know more about PAL's recovery plan. Will schedules and frequencies be affected in domestic or international routes? And how will the restructuring affect passenger travel? Will it have an effect on employees as well? Please tell us more, Gilbert.
Okay, so your description of Chapter 11, the Chapter 11 process was spot on. Chapter 11 refers to Chapter 11 of U.S. Bankruptcy Code, which refers to reorganization of a company, as you say, reducing our debts and adjusting our contracts and our obligations in order to reflect future business that is quite different from the previous one. And our creditors will have a say in the plan. Right, that is very different from Chapter 7, which is a liquidation and the end of the enterprise. So we selected a Chapter 11 process in the US because it's widely recognized around the world, and most of our creditors, especially the ones who own the aircraft, are not in the Philippines. And so the US process was going to be transparent and easy for them to understand. Now, what does that mean? It means we will continue to operate while we are going through the process. I'm happy to report that last night we had our what we call second day hearings, and every single motion passed with no objection, including the debtor in possession financing motion, which opens up the financing that we had set up for this process completely, as well as all the other motions to continue doing business in due course, right, in a normal business as usual basis. And while we are not yet out of the Chapter 11 process, the judge did compliment us on how well organized our process was. And in fact, we will have no unsecured creditors committee, which is very unusual for a Chapter 11 process because our creditors are all alongside. And the judge was very complimentary and said it was the quickest hearing she'd ever had to preside over. So I'm very happy to report that we are marching along the process we set up. And we will continue operating, and passengers' tickets will be honored. And as soon as restrictions start to lift, when the pandemic starts to loosen its grip on the Philippines, then we will be able to fly more people back to their homes in the Philippines, in the region, and beyond.
Mm-hmm. So will schedules and frequencies be affected in domestic or international routes?
They've already been affected. They'll just get better as more capacity is put back in place as soon as the restrictions are lifted. So both the restrictions inside the Philippines, so we have interzonal restrictions. You can't even drive to Batangas without a PCR test, right? Much less fly to Mindanao. So when vaccinated people can travel with no restrictions, that will open up demand, that will increase demand, open capacity, drop prices, and be a general good thing for our economy and for our people. And the same dynamic will apply to the region as regional restrictions are lifted, and then beyond to the United States and Europe, etc. So there will be more, the schedules will open up, and there will be fewer disruptions other than for weather.
What about your employees? What effect will it have, the restructuring plan, on your employees?
Our employees are quite happy that the restructuring plan has proceeded as expected, and they are assured now of the continued survival of their employer, Philippine Airlines. Right, we completed our retrenchment as part of our restructuring plan before we filed, and so we did the work up front. That was completed in March. We don't anticipate adding more reductions unless, of course, things things go south and we have a resurgence of the pandemic. So we hope that doesn't happen.
So, Gilbert, can you tell me, if I were a frequent traveler, and will Philippine Airlines still honor my valid tickets, vouchers, my loyalty mileage, and refunds?
Absolutely. Especially the refunds, right? If your refund has not yet been paid, more than a year after you applied, call us, contact us, reach out, right? Because that means there was a failure in our process, because we've almost completed all our refunds as far as our backlogs are concerned. When I hear that people haven't been paid refunds in over a year, I please step up, let us know, because that should no longer be happening. We've been clearing recent refunds caused by the typhoon and other very recent disruptions. So old refunds should no longer be out there. If they are, please, please, please allow us to fix that for you so you can fly again.
There you go. And my next question is for the savvy Filipino traveler. The reduction in your aircraft fleet is also a matter of interest, as Philippine Airlines will delay the delivery of some Airbus planes. How will this affect the operations and keep you on track to recovery?
A part of Philippine Airlines' problem in 2019, even with $3 billion in revenue, at that point, we were overfleeted. We had too many aircraft. And having too many aircraft means you have too many assets you need to pay for. And that led to a situation where when the pandemic hit, we had way more debt than we knew how to handle. And so we had to refleet and reduce the size of our fleet, rather, and reduce the options we have for aircraft to fly to different destinations, pull back on some routes that were not economic, and reduce frequencies where it made sense, right? Given that demand is still about 70% below where it was before the pandemic, right? There's still plenty of capacity to go back to, but we have enough of a fleet to last us into a repeat of 2019. So we have enough aircraft for us to go into 2019 again, right? Which we anticipate will happen in 2024 or later. Now, if it so happens that demand spikes much faster, as it has for the domestic market in the United States, then we will be happy to rent used aircraft that are sitting in the deserts of the world right now, waiting for new owners to take them over.
How long do you surmise before our aviation industry will return to normal?
We will return to normal when the economy returns to normal. So we happen to be a leading indicator when they shut travel down in order to protect the economy from a pandemic. By definition, it drops our revenue to zero, right? And so once they reopen the economy, will also be a leading indicator for the recovery. And the recovery will really be in place when we're no longer worried about level alert 1, 2, 3, 4, MECQ, GCQ, L1Q. etc.
That's true. In filing for Chapter 11, Philippine Airlines is repositioning itself for long-term growth and profitability. And the first good news from the U.S. Chapter 11 court was the approval of your motion to voluntarily restructure your finances. And the court approved your restructuring plan to reduce the company's obligations by $2 billion, as you said earlier, to help it recover from the pandemic. Please take us through some of the steps. Like the infusion of new obligations and equity funding to provide sufficient liquidity for the airline, and the additional financing from global investors to help you through post restructuring activities.
Sure. So Chapter 11, the Chapter 11 process we entered into in a voluntary, prearranged basis, which means we negotiated with our creditors before we filed. And what that means is we agreed with the creditors new terms of our contracts with each independent individual creditor on a bilateral basis, and then collectively assured the creditors that while our level of business with them might drop, they will be assured of continuing to do business with us into the future. Therefore, they reduced our debt obligations by over $2 billion, as you had called out. And in return, in order for us to have the working capital to continue to operate, our shareholders had agreed to provide debtor in possession financing, which is the kind of financing that exists within a Chapter 11 process. Nobody will lend to a company that's bankrupt, right? And our shareholders had basically not only indicated willingness, they had actually, in a process where we talked to other investors, they indicated that they were willing to, they were willing to take the lead. And so our debtor in possession financing was led entirely by our shareholders. And at the appropriate time when we exit the Chapter 11 process, some of that will be converted to equity, some of that will be converted to long-term debt. And then we will raise, as Philippine Airlines, once we exit, we will be back into the marketplace with a balance sheet now that banks can lend to, and we'll be in a position to approach other lenders for what we call exit financing that will help assure our creditors and shareholders of sufficient liquidity leading into the future.
Mhm. Earlier, you were talking about how the airline can recover as long as the restrictions, the lockdowns, border restrictions go back to normal. How is the airline, on that note, how is the airline coping with the frequent changes in quarantine lockdowns, border restrictions?
With as much agility as we can muster. So, what's interesting about Philippine Airlines, because it is the flag carrier, we are in very close touch with the government. We've been partnering with them since the beginning of the pandemic, when we started repatriating Filipinos home as early as the Diamond Princess in February of last year, and the first Filipino crewmen were stuck in a ship in Japan. We managed that repatriation. We managed the repatriation in and out of the Philippines of Filipinos and foreigners. Yes. We continue to do so. And we've been flying commercial routes. We've been flying the vaccines in. We've been flying supplies in. We've never stopped. So, we anticipate that the restrictions will continue to be in place. So one of our responses, for example, is we from ASEAN countries, we will fly to other airports than Manila because the restriction on arrival limits of 2,000 passengers is in Manila. So we will fly to Subic, Davao, Lawag, and General Santos has opened up. Zamboanga has opened up. And we will look at other airports that can take either our narrow bodies or our wide bodies and fly overseas foreign flights into those cities where the passengers can quarantine and follow the requisite quarantine regulations, after which we will take them to their final destinations in the Philippines. That way we open the country up some more without creating more stress in the Manila hospital environment, because part of the reason the restrictions are in place is to ensure we have the appropriate level of hospital capacity to deal with any surge. As the surge lifts, hopefully these restrictions will lift and we will continue to fly wherever it is we need to fly to bring Filipinos home or bring Filipinos out.
Mhm. Okay, so now these are the questions of a layperson on the street. How long will the rehab take, and is there a set estimate?
We expect to exit the Chapter 11 formal process before the end of the year, but clearly that's up to the judge to determine.
Mhm.
Given the judge's comments last night that we were very organized and that she hadn't seen a DIP approval process with no objections, and the fact that we don't have an unsecured creditor committee, we see no major obstructions to actually completing the process before the end of this year. So this is very, very different than the old process that Philippine Airlines undertook in 1998 after the Asian crisis, when it took 7-8 years to exit rehabilitation.
Mhm. And what are your projections? When will we have an uptick in numbers?
Well, as long as we're allowed to fly more passengers from month into month, we should have an uptick. We are now entering what typically will be the peak period for travel in the Philippines, the so-called bear months.
Mhm.
And the challenge will be if you are a Filipino living overseas, like a place like the United States or the Middle East, you have 2 weeks of vacation that allows you to go home for Christmas and New Year,
Mhm.
but you have to spend 10 days in a hotel in quarantine. You probably will not travel.
Yes.
If that quarantine is reduced to 5 days, then you will, right? And so we anticipate an uptick. And we've been transforming our business even as we made the changes that we needed to make to our balance sheet. We've been changing our business as well. And we will have a very laser focus on delivering the right service to our passengers, because it's very clear to us our passengers are willing to pay for the service,
Mhm.
right? And we will make sure we will not forget the Filipino passenger, because without the Filipino passenger, we will not exist.
That's true.
So we will make sure that is done. That will lead us to profitability and a sustained future.
That's true. I know. I know you understand how invested Filipinos are in knowing the fate of PAL. Like, for example, like me, bilang magulang, if I have a son who wants to be a pilot, sasabihin ko na, diyan ka sa Philippine Airlines, di ba? Ako, nung bata ko, gusto kong maging flight attendant ng Philippine Airlines, no? So, I know you understand how invested Filipinos are and hopeful for the future of PAL and what will happen. What's the biggest risk do you think, to the success of PAL's restructuring, if there's one, and what will be the challenge to PAL after its restructuring?
Our biggest risk remains the nature of the pandemic. We just dealt with a Delta variant, and it looks like we are exiting the surge of the Delta variant. We can't predict whether another variant might be in the works or another virus might be in the works that could create what they call a black swan event that will lead us back to a 2020 level type of lockdown, right? And after 2 years of this, everyone's exhausted. And that is the most unpredictable part of it, because we've been dealing with the completely unexpected from early last year.
Mhm.
And so it's very hard for us to plan going forward and say this is the one single risk we're concerned about, right? There are lots of risks. If fuel prices spike because of either unusual demand or unusual limitation in supply for whatever reason, then that will be a threat to the entire aviation industry and the transportation sector in the Philippines,
Mhm.
as well as the Philippine economy, since we are so dependent on imported fuel.
Mhm.
Right, among other things. So I could go through a whole laundry list of risks. In general, we have mitigated what we could by making sure our balance sheet is stronger and that we have a much more laser-like focus on our ability to make a profit, right? Break even and fly profitably. And we think we know how to do that.
Right.
And if nothing outside of the ordinary occurs, we anticipate Philippine Airlines, what we call the great 80-year-old lady, will continue to fly.
That's
And
right.
so that is our responsibility.
That's
And we have no intention of giving her up at all.
Right. Despite the exhaustion and uncertainty, what is the secret to the resilience of Philippine Airlines?
Oh, it's people.
Mm.
Without question, it's people. Now, Philippine Airlines have a kind of nice anecdote. In early last year, during the crisis around the emergence of COVID, when it was still called SARS-CoV-2,
Yes.
right? Not yet COVID-19. And the Diamond Princess was the one singular event that the world was looking at, right? And we needed to evacuate Filipinos.
Mhm.
There clearly was a debate internal to Philippine Airlines about whether we would fly or not, because one concern was we don't want to be the entity responsible for bringing the virus into the Philippines, right? That could potentially be a destroyer of our brand. And the government called and said nobody else is going to fly them home. And so I said, okay, I'll find volunteers. If there are no volunteers, we can't fly. And we got hundreds of volunteers. So we flew. And we continue to fly.
That's true. The loyalty and reverence of its employees have buoyed PAL through this crisis.
Yep. And the loyalty and the support of the Filipino people.
That's true. Yes.
Right? Every OFW flight for us has been a lifeline.
That's right. Despite the, I think you mentioned this earlier, despite having gone through the worst years, one of the worst years in aviation, PAL had its bright spots. Like you said, PAL actively participated in the transport of vital medical supplies to different provinces. And I'm happy to note PAL also was at the forefront of repatriation efforts with different countries. Could you tell us more bright spots from PAL?
The pandemic has been a general bright spot for us, right? It's things about challenges like this that take you outside of your fixation on the enterprise alone, right? The people of Philippine Airlines in the middle of last year were less concerned about is PAL going to survive. They were very concerned about, is my family going to be okay,
Yes.
right? And in that case, you know, their contribution to the recovery of the Philippines or the defense of the Philippines from COVID was to mount those flights and was to make sure that Philippine Airlines was there for all the sweepers that picked up foreigners all over the Philippines, flew them into our hub airports, and then flew them home. And then bringing Filipinos back from places like Tajikistan and Beirut, where we normally don't fly, and you never see the tail and the name of the Philippines on the plane. We flew there last year, and it kept a lifeline open. It was a symbol of hope for us.
True. How has PAL helped the country in this pandemic? Like, how essential is the recovery of PAL in a time of pandemic?
Well, we were absolutely essential during the pandemic, but we as an airline and as part of the aviation business, we are absolutely essential in connecting an archipelagic country, with each other. You don't take a ship from Davao to Manila. Nobody really does that anymore. Nobody's done that since I was a boy living in Mindanao, right? You flew, and you generally flew on Philippine Airlines. Now they have choices. Most people have choices. But in order to link the islands together, you fly. And it's not just passengers, right? One of the reasons why we fly wide bodies into General Santos is it's one of the biggest sources of cargo, right, for the world, right? We fly tuna to Japan and the US and Canada from Jensan, but we also fly fruit and seafood into Manila from Mindanao through General Santos and Davao and Cagayan de Oro and places like that. And so we are deeply in tune with the market. It's fruit season now. Unfortunately, the mangosteens didn't flower as well as they were expected to in Mindanao this year. So the mangosteen harvest is down, but pomelos are up. And for those who eat durian, durian is up. Lots of cheap, very delicious durian. And we're plugged into that because people will ship it on us, right? And our bellies are full of cargo because economic activity won't cease. We'll bring balut from Central Luzon to Mindanao, and then fruit and fish on the way back, etc. These are essential activities that everyone takes for granted, but we provide what we call the metal to make it happen.
In a slightly larger perspective, are you also keeping an eye out how other airlines in the region are coping?
Yes, we are. We are keeping a very close eye because we are kindred airlines, right? We are part of IATA and also the Association of Asia Pacific Airlines, AAPA, and we keep track of what our governments are doing on restrictions, virus prevention, infection prevention, etc. And we've been keeping track of policy responses of different governments and helping each other with data and information. Right? So we have stayed in close touch, and we do want to make sure that the airlines around the region, especially the ones with whom we have code shares, are aware that we will continue to operate, that they can connect to our flights, and that we can continue to do business with each other, because we will connect people and cargo with other airlines as a matter of course, as we have before the pandemic, and all airlines, right? Especially us being a long-time network carrier. We have a lot more in the way of code shares and interline agreements than other airlines in the Philippines.
And I also see that PAL has renewed its vigor in its marketing and sales efforts with new programs like Fly Now, Pay Later. I also read about the Hiraya Flight Pass, which allows passengers to pre-purchase flights with open travel dates for all domestic routes, with invigorated promotions and renewed partnerships with other airlines. Could you tell us more about these?
Well, you ain't seen nothing yet, right? As they say. We will continue to roll these out. Passengers have been asking for these things for years. The fact that there was a pandemic allowed us the time and the bandwidth to actually start making changes that were essential, not just to marketing programs, but actually to the infrastructure, the digital infrastructure that now underlies most enterprises in the Philippines even. Everybody's digital now. So we're making sure that we have products and services that customers want and are willing to pay for.
Seeing all these activities, promotions, and positive mindset in PAL, I'm really happy for the airline and how your plans are all coming together. Now, Gilbert, someone once told me that Philippine Airlines is built on the dreams of the Filipino to travel, to seek employment, to renew ties with a friend or a loved one, to come back to a familiar place. Simple dreams fulfilled with the means to fly. What is your message now to Filipinos who continue to look up to the national carrier and its efforts to restructure and to recover during these interesting and daunting times?
Well, the dreams you described apply to me. I kind of had to go around the Philippines in the 1980s on Philippine Airlines flights. I grew up in Mindanao. I went to school in Manila, UP, and then I became an immigrant. I left also, and then PAL took me to my dreams. Right? I still remember my PAL flight when I moved to the U.S. over 30 years ago. So, and those memories are very evocative. And Filipinos have very different dreams now, perhaps, but we will still be here to serve the need for travel. And we will serve Filipinos first, because that's really who we are. That's in our identity. We're not going to be an airline that's a luxury carrier like some of the ones you will see, right? We're clearly not a low-cost carrier. We do care about your comfort, and we do care about ensuring that you reach your destination in reasonably good shape. But we will be around for the long term, right? As Asia's oldest airline. We're not the first necessarily, but the ones that went before us are gone already, right? We're still here after 80 years, and we intend to stay here for a while.
That's true. Thank you for your time, Gilbert. I know you're a very busy man working on rebuilding the airline, a legacy to the Filipino people, and best wishes to Kapitan and to your team in this recovery effort. Thank you so much for your
Thank you very much. Thank you.